where I want to start us off today is with the riots that are happening at the moment around Europe. The normally chill people of Europe are currently kicking off big style about restrictions around COVID and all that kind of thing. And of course, that brings to mind our own riots that we had in the UK around COVID. As you'll remember, the toilet paper riots. Do you remember way back when you couldn't get toilet paper anywhere and it was absolutely horrific? You know, it was dark days for those who had not stocked up on toilet paper and did not own a bidet. But of course, no one. Real people don't have that. Like old hotels are the only places that have those anymore. In Italy. Okay. Oh, right. Oh, right. Okay. So Europe and old hotels have bidets. Okay, this is good. Okay, if you remember nothing else from today, you know where to go to get a bidet when the toilet paper runs out. And of course, what happened was when everyone was grabbing the toilet paper more than they needed, everyone was saying in the streets and writing in the newspapers, "Oh, isn't everyone selfish? This is how selfish our culture has become. Isn't it awful?" As if it was a new thing. And it is not a new thing. When pandemics have been with us as long as human beings have been around, and they've swept through civilizations, they've destroyed cities, and when you look at the history of the times when the Bible was written, they had a lot of them. They lived through a lot of pandemics, they swept through their cities as well. And what happened back then is very similar to what happened with us. And obviously this was prior to any kind of medical intervention that could have saved them. So basically the cities emptied out. So a plague or a pandemic would sweep through a city, and anyone who could afford to would go out to the countryside where it was safe, often leaving even sick relatives in the city to die. I've got a book at home which I read a few years ago, which I absolutely love, called The Rise of Christianity. It's by called Rodney Stark, who's a professor of sociology, and interestingly not a Christian, but he was looking into why it was that Christianity rose from this weird little sect in Judaism, like this tiny little thing, into the biggest religion the world had ever known in just 300 years. And his assertion was, and is, that we've never seen growth like that before. We've never seen a global change like that before. So what was it about Christianity that meant that that could happen? And one of the reasons he found was that when these pandemics swept through cities, Christians did not hoard the toilet paper and leg it out to the countryside, but actually they stayed to take care of their sick. And when people had abandoned their own friends and relatives, they took care of those people as well. And he said purely on a nursing level, like if you give someone care if they've got the bubonic plague or whatever it was back then their chances of survival go up enormously. So on a completely natural level, Christians had a higher survival rate. But not just that. Those people who'd been abandoned by their friends and family are like, wait a second, I think I want to have a bit of what's going on over here. These people, these strangers who owed me nothing, came in and took care of me. But Christians were a very odd little group of people when they started. Some would say we still are an odd little group of people. Come join us. So on the one hand, they were predominantly Jewish, and they were very Jewish in the way they acted and did things, and they were obviously ethnically Jewish. But they also invited non-Jewish people to join their community, and as a result, they were shunned by eventually other Jewish groups, the majority of them, so they didn't fit there. They were religious, like the whole world was back then, but not in a way that was expected of them. So we've got some ancient texts that criticize Christians as being very weird because they didn't have priests, they didn't have temples, they didn't do animal sacrifices. Basically, they didn't do the things that everyone else did that was necessary to make you a proper religion. And most seriously of all, they didn't worship all of the other gods. They only worshipped one God. So they didn't belong in the rest of the world, and they didn't really belong to Judaism anymore. They were just odd little group. They didn't fit any box whatsoever. And as a result, they were excluded from power, they were excluded from influence. They're not getting promotions in their jobs, they're losing the jobs that they do have, they can't get any seats of power. This led to a dwindling of money, increasing poverty, all that kind of thing. And then eventually, as the resistance increased over the years, they were put to death in enormous numbers because they were seen as such a threat. So this weird group that don't fit anywhere, that are outsiders, that are being put to death, they're being excluded from society, also grow in number faster than any movement has ever grown in the history of Earth. So what is going on here? Well, it's a different author. This guy is a New Testament scholar. His name's Larry Hurtado, and he's written 2 books about this phenomenon. The first one is Destroyer of the Gods, Early Christian Distinctives in the Roman World. And, I didn't type the name of the other one. Sorry, that's terrible, that's shocking. But anyway, he's written a couple of books on this. And the famous one is Destroyer of the Gods, which is also an awesome name. And again, Anne, you'll know this one because it was referenced in our common book that we've been reading. Yes, your face says, yes, I remember this reference. Yes, that really affected me. And he says basically the reason Christianity grew was because they were so distinctive. And he points out 5 ways in which they were distinct. So firstly, the Christian community was uniquely multiracial and multicultural, and had extraordinary unity in it. So at that time, no other group had that number of different races within it, different ethnic backgrounds, different cultural backgrounds, and yet was so united. That was unique. Something else that was unique about them, the second one, is that they were non-violent and non-retaliatory. So remember, they're losing their jobs, they're being excluded, they're becoming poor, they're even being put to death. However, for the first 300 years of Christianity, they were exclusively and strongly non-violent. It was arguable whether you could even be a soldier and be a Christian. It was that strong. They never fought back. The third one he found was that they took care of the poor and the suffering. So this is what we've talked about. Unlike anyone else, they took care not just of their own poor and not just of their own sick, but other people's as well. And no one did that at the time. The fourth distinctive is that they were committed to guarding all human life. So abortion was really rare back then, but it did happen occasionally. But what was more common was what's called exposure. So an unwanted child was born and they would leave it out on the street to die, or taken away to be sold into slavery. And Christians were, again, in their culture, alongside other Jewish people, the only ones who did not do that. But they went even further than that. They went and rescued children that had been left out to die and raised them as their own. And then the fifth distinction he finds is that in a culture that was highly sexualized, like way more than ours, and where sex was to do with your status and your power and your influence, Christians only practiced sex within marriage. And so they had celibates amongst them, which was unheard of. And important men, some men who had converted, only had sex with their wives, which was, it sounds weird to us, but unimaginable in their culture at their time. And what Tim Keller, my personal hero, points out, and this is my only Tim Keller reference, I allow myself one, there's always one, he points out about this list from Larry Hurtado, is that 2 of these sound really left-wing to us, really kind of like labor kind of values. So they're multiracial, multi-ethnic, they're diverse and united, and they take care of the poor and the suffering. 2 others of them sound really kind of like right-wing values to us, quite conservative values. So they're pro-life, essentially, in the most extreme sense, and they're very reserved when it comes to sexuality. And then points out as well, the second one, the fact that they're non-violent and non-retaliatory, they're not even against other people, doesn't even sit anywhere on the left-right spectrum at all. No one does that. Even if you're not violent, you're critical of the other side, or aggressive towards the other side in other ways. Nobody does that. So what he's saying is, back then and today, the Christian operating system is totally different to anything else we know. It doesn't function like any political party, like any other philosophy. So where on earth does this operating system come from that Christians run on? Well, this morning I was listening to my playlist as I was getting ready for this. A worship song came on called Christ Be Magnified. Put it on our shared playlist if you want to listen to it. And the bridge goes like this. I won't bow down to idols. I'll stand strong and worship you. So that's something that Christians didn't do. They didn't worship other gods. If it puts me in the fire, I'll rejoice because you're there too. I won't be formed by feelings. I hold fast to what is true. If the cross brings transformation, then I'll be crucified with you. Because death is just the doorway into resurrection life. And if I join you in suffering, then I'll join you when you rise. And what this song is putting beautifully and poetically is that the death and resurrection of Jesus changed everything. It changed everything. How we operate, what we love, what we do with our lives, how we relate to people who aren't like us, how we relate to people who need our help. It changed absolutely everything. The life that Jesus carried in his body when he was resurrected didn't just stay with him. It went out from him into his group of his friends, the disciples, and from there out into the world and started making everything else new again. Why would they have such a high view of human life? Because Jesus thought it was worth dying to save. And they didn't do it, but they didn't do it rather through the usual means of cultural influence. That's, wealth, good PR, military might, whatever, political strength. They did it through self-giving and self-sacrifice because, as Jesus said, the cross is a calling on everyone who would come follow him. It's a way to live. It's putting yourself second and others first. So for the followers of Jesus, the death and resurrection of Jesus are not just historical events that we remember at Easter or interesting theology that we read about in books, but it's the power of God and the wisdom of God. It's a whole new operating system. And more than that, it's the first and biggest domino in a series of dominoes that have been clicking throughout history to change the whole world. For them, it was fearlessness in the face of opposition, even to the point of death. It was strength to get through today. It was hope for tomorrow. It was new life. It was eternal life, not just when they went to heaven, but eternal life beginning right now with the power and life of Jesus coursing through their veins. It was the redemption of their families, neighborhoods, their schools, and workplaces. It's the end of death, the end of sickness, the end of injustice. It's the greatest resource the world has against things like slavery, poverty, moral decline, and that is destroying so many lives right now. It's more powerful than any nation or army that has ever lived. It's outlived them all and has had more influence for good than any single one of them. So we are the only movement on earth whose founder is still alive, is reigning in heaven, and will come back to reign again. Can I get an amen? There we go. That was my moment to kind of... But the truth is, as amazing as all of that is, and as true as all that is, it doesn't always feel that way day to day. It often feels like the world is the one that's winning, that the smart people are outside of the church, and that Christianity is kind of dwindling, and that once again we're the weird outsiders that better keep our mouths shut because some of our opinions are very unpopular. And it can feel like, for those of us that even really do believe and all that kind of thing, that, the cross and the resurrection are that distant event that we do remember once a year, and that it's just a bunch of abstract theology, and it doesn't really hit our hearts. And if we're honest, that we ourselves have a ton of questions and doubts, if not about specifically the cross and resurrection, about a million other things around the fringes of our faith. And even every now and again, we might just ask that question, is this all real at all, or am I going crazy? So in the face of overwhelming cultural influence and internal doubts, we find our friend in Thomas. I'm going to turn now to John chapter 20 and beginning at verse 19. And this recalls the events after Jesus has died and risen again, but they're yet to find out about that. So on the evening of the first day of the week, when the disciples were together, with the doors locked for the fear of the Jews. And again, just a bit of clarity on that because it's important. When we use the word Jews in the New Testament, it's insider language. Everyone here is Jewish. It's talking about the fact that they're a sect within Judaism, and so they're an outsider. Also refers to the fact that they're from the north, and it could be referring to the Judeans who are from the south. Jesus was a northerner. Deal with that. And Jerusalem's down south, and so they're not from there. They've got different accents, all that kind of thing. So there's all that kind of going on there. So it's not an anti-Semitic thing, just to clarify. So anyway, Jesus came and stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." After he had said this, he showed them his hands and his side. The disciples were overjoyed when they saw the Lord. Again, Jesus said, "Peace be with you. As the Father has sent me, I am sending you." And with that, he breathed on them and said, "Receive the Holy Spirit. If you forgive anyone their sins, they are forgiven. If you do not forgive them, they are not forgiven." Now Thomas, called Didymus, fun fact, Thomas was a twin, that's what that means, one of the 12, was not with the disciples when Jesus came. So the other disciples told him, "We have seen the Lord." But he said to them, "Unless I see the nail marks in his hands and put my finger where the nails were and put my hand into his side, I will not believe it." A week later, his disciples were in the house again, and Thomas was with them. Through the door, though the doors were locked, Jesus came and stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." Then he said to Thomas, "Put your finger here, see my hands. Reach out your hand and put it into my side. Stop doubting and believe." Thomas said to him, "My Lord and my God." Then Jesus told him, "Because you have seen me, you have believed. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed." And these next two verses are a textual note for people like you and me. Jesus did many other miraculous signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not recorded in this book. But these are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. Now can I get an amen? We'll get there yet. We'll get there yet. The disciples' lives completely changed the moment that they saw Jesus alive again. But Thomas didn't see it. He heard about it from them, but he abjectly refused to believe it, which meant that though the death and resurrection of Jesus had already changed the world completely, for Thomas it had changed nothing because he wouldn't believe it. So I wonder, and I want you to imagine you are one of the 10 disciples who has seen Jesus, has seen the scar marks, and Thomas is like, "No, won't believe it unless I see it, unless I'm like, what would you do? Imagine you're one of those 10s. What would you do with Thomas? How would you feel about him? And while he is stubbornly refusing to believe what you are telling him is true. Have you ever had someone not believe you? How frustrating is that? Especially when you know it's true. So I grew up the youngest of 3, and I was geeky. I knew a lot about tech. I knew a lot about computers. But that didn't matter because I was the youngest, so nothing I said counted for anything. And I've mentioned this before. I remember that feeling of frustration of like, I know this is true, but no one else is believing me or listening to me because it's just Dave. I would have been so frustrated. Are you calling me a liar? Are you saying I made this up? You're saying all 10 of us hallucinated Jesus in the room. Like, what are you saying, Thomas? What's wrong with you? I would have got so annoyed with him and said, sent him on his way. Like, done with you. Do you know what I mean? And the temptation is to condemn someone like that. But that's not what Jesus does at all. And I think what's really instructive for us in how Jesus relates to Thomas is that it escapes what I think personally are the kind of two equal and opposite errors we can come into with doubt. On the one end, we condemn anyone who's having doubts. We don't have time for them to work through their problems. We're like, oh, come on, get on with it. We get frustrated with them and we put them down. We don't give them time to walk through that journey. On the other end, and what can happen in our culture is we celebrate doubt as if it's like the most elevated way of thinking. And that comes from our cultural history. So right now, in America, where there's enough Christians for there to be a Christian culture, like deconstructionism is kind of like running rife right now, where people are deconstructing their faith, and it's seen as a very kind of like advanced way of thinking. I'm very smart because I'm questioning everything, I'm deconstructing it all. But really, that just comes from a branch of philosophy from the 19th century, which is actually a technical way of analyzing things. And it's kind of drifted into the mainstream unknowingly. And what people are doing are just pulling things down, questioning everything, doubting everything, but they're not constructing anything. And that was never how it was meant to be used. Deconstructionism is a way of dismantling things that are untrue in order to replace them with truth, which is actually what I'd argue Jesus is pushing Thomas towards. Deconstruct what is not true, disbelieve the things that are not true, and then believe what is true. There's a really good sermon online by John Marcomer about this called We're All Thomas Now. It's this thing that doubt is seen as clever and sophisticated in the way that smart people think. But it's actually, just as in life, it's much easier to destroy stuff and knock it down than it is to construct a belief. Biblically, doubt means to be divided. That's the kind of root of the word, to be split into two. Not sure what you believe between two different truths. And so, therefore, not quite sure which of the two faiths to trust. Not quite sure which two ways of life to go. It's an unstable place, but it is one that anyone who has faith must pass through. And actually, when you look at all the teachings in the Bible about doubt, for me, what it's saying in summary is you will go through this, just don't stay there. That when the Bible warns about doubt, to me what it's saying is just don't live there. Don't live in a place of being constantly divided between two ways of life, two opinions, two places of trust and faith. But make your decision, because to live in a place of doubt is inherently unstable. Because you're kind of riding two horses with one ass, as one film I saw said. You're straddling the fence and you're getting splinters. Because that's not a place we can live, but it is a place we all pass through. And if we look further into the example of Jesus, I think it shows us how we can pass through these periods of doubt. So J.C. Ryle, first bishop of Liverpool, and definitely a former bishop of Liverpool, very dead now, but commenting on this passage, he makes the brilliant observation that the things we believe in faith may be, on occasion, above our reason. And that's simply because we are small human beings who have a small lifespan, small brains, in a massive universe. We are much smaller than God. We cannot have the mind of God because of who we are. And so there are some things that transcend our understanding, but they are never contrary to our senses. So Thomas demands to see and to touch. And what I find extraordinary is that Jesus does not condemn Thomas for that, but word for word meets his demands. Look at the scars, touch the scars in my hand and in my side. The hand with a means of execution. Crucifixion was a brutal but very effective way of killing people. The scar on his side was the test that he was dead. So when they put the spear in, blood and water came out. The blood had separated from the plasma. It was proof that he was dead, had been dead for a while. And so what he was seeing and touching were the means of death and the proof of death. Jesus, there's this kind of false belief that faith is counter to reason. And that is not what Jesus is demonstrating here. He says, if it's true, you will be able to see it and touch it. It will hold up to your senses. And again, he's not condemning Thomas for asking for that evidence. Again, the common belief is that faith is all about leaps in the dark and just trusting anyway and all of that kind of thing. And there's definitely moments where we have to trust God despite not having all of the evidence and all that kind of thing. But that's not how he treats Thomas. He says, go after the evidence. Here is the evidence. Believe what you see. And certainly, not everyone, but a lot of people over the years have come to faith from following the evidence. It's really annoying that we don't get to see those scars and touch those scars ourselves, but there is still plenty of evidence, as Pete was saying, that this is true. And once we know it is true, we can then follow the conclusions for how we should live. I think the other thing that we learned, second thing we learned from Thomas, is that actually questions lead to a deeper faith, not a shallower one. So not in this occasion, but just before Jesus was executed and he's getting his disciples ready for this moment, he says that he is going to return to his Father, and you know the way that I am going. And all the disciples are like, yes, going to the Father, except for Thomas. He's like, what are you talking about? Or, to use the quote, Lord, we don't know where you're going, so how can we know the way? Of all of the disciples, Thomas was the only one who actually went, we have no idea what you're talking about, actually. And as a result, Jesus responded with one of the greatest declarations of his divinity, his godly nature in all of the Bible. We got a whole bunch of understanding about Jesus, not just disciples, us as well, because Thomas asked the question, because he was the one who was asking what everyone else was thinking when no one else was. So actually asking questions led to a deeper faith and understanding, a better faith, not a worse one. I think a third thing that we learn from Thomas is that he missed out because he was isolated from community. For whatever reason, all the other disciples were together and Thomas was not there. And we can speculate, but I'm guessing that he had given up more than anyone else had given up amongst the disciples. He was maybe like those other disciples on the road to Emmaus. He was starting to plan ahead, plan a different kind of life, but he wasn't with them. And this is a pattern those of us who've been in church for a while have seen again and again. Is like once someone stops gathering with people, stops meeting on Sunday, stops meeting midweek, and those doubts start to set in, then a trajectory is cast away from community. But quite often when that doubt comes in, and you can ask it, and that question is met with grace, 1 minute can put aside a lifetime of suffering away from the church. The number of times someone has been months away from the church and has sat down for a coffee, and after about 2 minutes, they're like, oh, they could have had a 2-minute conversation and missed all of that. And as it was, Thomas had a whole week not living in the truth of the resurrection because he simply was not at church. He was not with his community. A fourth thing to learn, fourth of five to learn from Thomas, it's important to doubt the doubts. Doubt the doubts. That's what Jesus is doing. If you have a doubt about your faith, in whatever area it might be, that means there is a contrary truth that you are starting to trust. How about you doubt that? How about you put the same level of critical thinking towards the doubt itself as you are putting towards the faith? What is that based upon? Is that trustworthy? Is that true? It's only fair if you're doubting the faith to doubt the doubt itself, to put the same scrutiny back the other way. That's what Jesus is doing with Thomas. Thomas quite rightly thinks that people do not come back from the dead. They knew that then, as we know that now. And Jesus is saying, look at the contrary evidence. Someone has. Someone has come back. Thomas also had moments of bravery. In John 11, we have him recorded as saying with Jesus, let us also go that we may die with him. As Jesus is saying, I'm going towards my death, he's, again, the one who pipes up and says, we will go and we will die with you. A moment of bravery. We remember him as doubting Thomas. We don't remember him as brave Thomas. But the whole point of Thomas, and I think probably the reason John dwells on him so much, is like whether it's a moment of bravery or a moment of doubt, that doesn't have to define us. It's what happens next. It's where we move to. And so make the journey. As Jesus said to him, put your finger here, see my hands, put out your hand, place it in my side. Do not disbelieve, but believe. That is the call of Jesus when we have doubt, is to make the journey from unbelief to belief, not to live forever in doubt. But he is incredibly patient with us. He calls out to us to ask the questions, to make the journey, to see the evidence, to think it through for ourselves, and to trust this new world. He does not condemn doubters for their lack of faith. But neither does he celebrate doubt as if it's this highly evolved way of being a human, but calls us to make the journey from disbelief to belief. Now, I've asked you to imagine that you are one of the disciples and how you'd feel about Thomas and what you'd do. Now I want you to imagine that you're Jesus. You've been through an unjust trial, you've been executed, you've been treated appallingly, your friends have abandoned you, everyone has been against you, and 3 days later, you are alive again. What do you do? I know what I do. I go to Pilate's house. I go through the locked doors like he did with the disciples with his new resurrected powers. I'm like, remember me, Pilate? He sent me to my death. I'm back. I'm going to the scribes and the Pharisees. Remember where you had me executed on false charges? I'm back, baby. I'm alive again. You can't kill me. Jesus doesn't do that either. It's astonishing when you really think about it. Having been abandoned by these people, having had these false charges put against him, having been put to death, he goes to not to his enemies to get revenge, but to his friends, including those who had abandoned him, and says 3 times, "Peace be with you." We're coming up to Christmas, where we will remember that when Jesus was born, the angels sang peace on earth. Jesus declared peace throughout his ministry. Before he went to the cross, he said, "Peace be with you" to his disciples. He said it was going to be okay. And then after his resurrection, he comes back and he says, "Peace be with you." Peace is at the core of a faithful ministry to Jesus, because Jesus is bringing peace on earth. So wonderfully, we have experienced Pete's search for evidence and also Karen's experiential experience. That's bad grammar. That's terrible grammar. Experiential experience of peace in your life. And knowing it's true because you have experienced that peace. The disciples, having been through everything they had been through, he came to them literally terrified for their lives. Doors are locked because they think they're going to have the same thing happen to them as happened to Jesus. And he stands in the middle of them. He's like, "Peace. Peace be with you." Which means we don't change the world the way that everyone else tries to change the world. Through force, coercion, influence, politics, power, money, none of that. But by witnessing to the good news that somebody came back, that death is not the end, that injustice does not get the final say, that the redemption of the world is underway. If the message is peace, the means is peace. Remember the distinctives of the early church, why they spread so much? Because they loved people they owed nothing to. They did not retaliate against those who resisted them. They were, in Jesus' words, salt and light. They were connected to their neighborhoods, their workplaces, their schools, etc. But they were different. They lived the way of death and resurrection. So when we encounter people who are new Christians or non-Christians and they've got all of these questions and doubts, let's be patient with them the way that Jesus was patient with them. And when we have questions and doubts, know that Jesus will be gentle and patient with us, but also call us to belief from our disbelief. Because when we believe, like really, really believe that someone came back, that the world is being redeemed, that Jesus' mission of peace is going out, that changes everything. For me, I love the fact that Jesus carries those scars, that he didn't get rid of them, that he wasn't embarrassed about them, because when those scars were shown to those disciples, when the scars met their doubts, their world changed. Those scars which to them meant the end and complete defeat suddenly became the beginning and victory. The world had changed when the scars met their doubt. When my own doubts, not intellectual ones, but caused by the things that and the people that we have lost in life, when they have met Jesus and not been rebuffed, but embraced, I've discovered deeper levels of faith in my own life. When my own doubts have met the scars of Jesus, everything changed. So the call remains the same for us, to be that same weird community, not withdrawn from everyone else to keep ourselves safe, not fighting everyone else, trying to get power the way that everyone else does, but being salt sprinkled out in the community, in our families, neighborhoods, workplaces, schools, being light on a hill, showing that there will be peace. There can be peace right now, that the world is being redeemed, that death and injustice are not the end. Walking the way of death because we know that there is resurrection on the other side.